It was supposed to be a simple parent-teacher conference. David Thompson, 45, school board president and successful technology consultant, had taken time off work to discuss his son Marcus's progress at Lincoln High School. His calendar notification had pinged at 2:30 p.m. Conference with Mrs. Anderson, room 214. He grabbed his briefcase, straightened his tie, and headed to the school where he'd once been a student himself, where he'd fought to improve conditions as a board member, where his son was now facing challenges he'd hoped belonged to a different era. The hallways smelled the same: floor polish and cafeteria food, lockers lined the walls, student artwork decorated bulletin boards. Everything looked normal, peaceful. But what David was about to witness would shatter that peace and force a school district to confront truths it had been avoiding for decades. David arrived at room 214 5 minutes early. Through the small window in the door, he could see his son Marcus, 16, sitting at a desk, shoulders hunched. Standing over him was Mrs. Patricia Anderson, a veteran teacher with 25 years at Lincoln High. David couldn't hear what she was saying, but Marcus's body language told him everything: shame, defeat, resignation. His son, usually confident and outspoken, looked like he wanted to disappear. David's hand reached for the door handle, but he paused. Something made him wait, watch, listen. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the memory of his own experiences with teachers who'd underestimated him. Whatever it was, that pause would change everything. Because what he overheard in the next 60 seconds would expose a pattern of discrimination that had been hiding in plain sight, affecting not just Marcus, but dozens of students whose potential had been crushed under the weight of lowered expectations and racial bias. Mrs. Anderson's voice carried through the door, sharp and condescending. "Marcus, I've told you repeatedly that students like you need to work twice as hard to succeed. This essay is simply unacceptable. The vocabulary, the syntax, this isn't your work." David's jaw tightened. "Students like you?" He pressed closer to the door, his phone now out, recording audio. "But, Mrs. Anderson," Marcus's voice was quiet, defensive. "I worked really hard on that essay. I spent all weekend." "Don't lie to me," Mrs. Anderson interrupted. "I know plagiarism when I see it. Students from your background don't produce this level of writing without help." David's blood ran cold. "From your background?" Marcus tried again, his voice stronger now. "I used the sources you recommended. I followed the rubric exactly." "The rubric is the minimum standard," Mrs. Anderson said dismissively. "Perhaps if you spent less time on basketball and more time studying, you'd understand the difference between minimum effort and actual achievement." "I make straight A's in every other class," Marcus protested. "Those teachers have different standards," Mrs. Anderson replied coolly. "In my classroom, I maintain excellence. And this," she held up what David assumed was Marcus's essay, "is far from excellent. In fact, I'm giving you a D." David had heard enough. But instead of bursting in immediately, he stepped back, pulled out his phone, and sent a quick text to the school principal. "Emergency. Room 214. Come now. Bring VP and counselor." Then he waited 30 more seconds, letting his recording continue, gathering evidence. Because this wasn't just about one essay or one grade, this was about a pattern. And David Thompson hadn't become school board president by acting on emotion instead of strategy. David finally pushed open the door. Both Marcus and Mrs. Anderson turned, startled. "Mr. Thompson," Mrs. Anderson said, quickly composing herself, her tone shifting to professional courtesy. "You're early." "I was just discussing Marcus's latest assignment." "I heard," David said quietly, his eyes on his son. Marcus's face showed a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Relief that his father was there, embarrassment that he'd witnessed the humiliation. Mrs. Anderson's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, since you're here, we can begin the conference. As I was explaining to Marcus, his work simply isn't meeting my standards." "Your standards," David repeated, setting his briefcase down carefully. "Tell me, Mrs. Anderson, what exactly are your standards for students like Marcus?" Her face flushed slightly. "I don't know what you mean." I think you do. I heard you through the door. Students from his background. Students like him. Want to clarify what you meant by that? Mrs. Anderson's composure cracked. Mr. Thompson, I think you're misunderstanding. Am I? David pulled out his phone. Because I have a recording that suggests otherwise. Her eyes widened. You were recording? That's an invasion of public space. One-party consent state. Perfectly legal. David's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. Now, shall we discuss why you accused my son of plagiarism without any evidence? Marcus sat up straighter, watching his father with growing amazement. Mrs. Anderson sputtered. I didn't accuse him of plagiarism. I simply suggested that the work seemed beyond his capabilities. Based on what? His grades? His previous work? Or based on the color of his skin? How dare you? But before the confrontation could escalate further, Principal Susan Chen appeared at the door with Vice Principal Robert Martinez and Guidance Counselor Jennifer Williams. All three looked concerned. David? Your text said emergency? Principal Chen's eyes swept the room, taking in the tense standoff. Yes, David said, his voice steady. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. Principal Chen stepped fully into the room, her professional demeanor shifting to high alert. She'd worked with David Thompson for 5 years, first as a fellow teacher, then as principal while he rose to board president. She knew him well enough to know he didn't cry wolf. What's going on? She asked, looking between David, Marcus, and Mrs. Anderson. David gestured to his son. Marcus, tell Principal Chen what just happened. Everything. Marcus hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Anderson, who was watching him with barely concealed warning in her eyes. It's okay, David encouraged. Tell the truth. Marcus took a deep breath. Mrs. Anderson said my essay was plagiarized. She said students from my background don't write at that level. She said I should spend less time on basketball and more time studying. Even though I have a 3.8 GPA, she gave me a D without any evidence that I copied anything. Principal Chen's expression darkened. Patricia, is this true? Mrs. Anderson drew herself up indignantly. I was simply maintaining academic standards. The essay showed sophisticated vocabulary and complex sentence structures that seemed inconsistent with Marcus's previous work. Show me the essay, Principal Chen interrupted. Mrs. Anderson reluctantly handed it over. The principal read quickly, her frown deepening. This is excellent work, she said finally. What exactly made you think it was plagiarized? The quality? Did you run it through plagiarism detection software? Mrs. Anderson paused. Well, no, but did you ask Marcus about his process? His sources? His drafts? I didn't feel it was necessary. But you felt it was necessary to accuse him without evidence? Principal Chen's voice had taken on an edge. And to make comments about his background? I was referring to his academic background. Don't, David interrupted quietly. Don't insult our intelligence. Vice Principal Martinez, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. Mrs. Anderson, this isn't the first complaint we've received about your assumptions regarding minority students. Mrs. Anderson's face went white. What complaints? No one has ever— They have, Counselor Williams said. To me. Multiple parents have expressed concerns about bias in your classroom. We've been documenting them. David's eyes narrowed. Documenting? For how long? Principal Chen shifted uncomfortably. David, there's been an ongoing review. For how long? David repeated, his voice harder now. 2 years, Vice Principal Martinez admitted quietly. The room went silent. 2 years. 2 years of complaints. 2 years of documentation. 2 years while students continued to be subjected to discrimination. David's composure finally cracked. 2 years. And you never thought to inform the board? To take action? We were building a case, Principal Chen said defensively. We needed solid evidence before making accusations. You needed solid evidence? David's voice rose. My son has been in her class for 4 months. How many other students has she damaged in 2 years while you built your case? Marcus stood up suddenly. It wasn't just me. She does this to all the black kids in our class. Everyone turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" Principal Chen asked. Marcus's words came faster now, 2 years of observation spilling out. Jamal got accused of cheating because he scored high on a test. Keisha got told her college essay was too ambitious and she should be realistic about state schools instead of applying to Stanford. Darnell got marked down for attitude problems when he questioned her interpretation of a book written by a black author. "That's not," Mrs. Anderson began. "It is," Marcus interrupted, his voice stronger than David had ever heard it. "And we all know it. We talk about it. But we didn't think anyone would believe us, because you're the teacher and we're just students who need to work harder and stop playing the race card." David placed a hand on his son's shoulder, both supporting and restraining him. "Marcus, breathe." But Marcus wasn't done. "You want to know what she said to me last month? When I mentioned wanting to study engineering, she laughed. Actually laughed. Said maybe I should consider vocational training instead. Be realistic about my limitations." Counselor Williams was typing furiously on her tablet. "That's consistent with other reports. 5 students this year alone have come to me about discouragement from pursuing STEM fields." Mrs. Anderson looked around the room, realizing the walls were closing in. "This is taken out of context. I was trying to help these students understand their realistic options." "Realistic?" David's voice was quiet now, dangerous. "My son has a 3.8 GPA. He's captain of the debate team. He volunteers at the community center tutoring younger kids. What exactly isn't realistic about his aspirations?" But the real shock was yet to come. The door opened again, and 3 students walked in: Jamal, Keisha, and Darnell. They'd clearly been waiting in the hallway, listening. "We heard Marcus," Jamal said, a tall young man with determination in his eyes. "We're here to back him up." Principal Chen looked flustered. "Students, this is a private conference." "This affects all of us," Keisha interrupted. She pulled out her phone. "I recorded Mrs. Anderson last week. Want to hear what she said about my Stanford application?" Mrs. Anderson's face went from white to gray. "You can't. That's illegal." "One-party consent," Darnell said, echoing David's earlier words. "Marcus's dad taught us that. We've been documenting everything since we realized no one was listening." The students played their recordings. Mrs. Anderson's voice, clear and undeniable, making assumption after assumption, crushing dream after dream, all couched in language about standards and realistic expectations. David listened, his jaw clenched, as his son and his son's friends presented a damning case built over months of discrimination. When the recordings ended, Principal Chen looked shaken. Vice Principal Martinez had his head in his hands. Even Counselor Williams, who'd known about the complaints, seemed surprised by the systematic nature of what they were hearing. "This is—" Principal Chen struggled for words. "This is far worse than we realized." "You think?" Marcus said, his usual respect for authority stripped away by frustration. "We've been trying to tell someone for months." "Years. But who listens to black students complaining about a white teacher with 25 years of experience?" Mrs. Anderson finally found her voice. "This is a witch hunt. These students are ganging up on me because I hold them accountable." "Accountable?" Keisha's voice shook with anger. "You told me I'd be taking a spot from more qualified students if I applied to Stanford. I have a 4.0 GPA and a perfect SAT score. Who's more qualified than that? You told me I was naturally athletic but probably not intellectually suited for advanced physics," Jamal added. "I won the state science fair. You marked my paper down because I disagreed with your interpretation of James Baldwin," Darnell said. "A black author. And when I cited actual Baldwin interviews to support my analysis, you said I was being confrontational." Each accusation hit like a hammer blow. David watched Mrs. Anderson's face cycle through denial, anger, and finally, a dawning realization that there was no way out. David pulled out his phone again. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting. Tonight. This can't wait for the regular schedule." "David, perhaps we should handle this internally first," Principal Chen began. "Internally?" David's laugh was bitter. You've been handling it internally for 2 years. How's that working out?" He turned to the students. "Jamal, Keisha, Darnell, Marcus, are you willing to present your evidence to the school board?" All 4 nodded without hesitation. "Then we'll do this the right way. Publicly. Transparently. No more documentation without action." Mrs. Anderson's voice was small now. "This will ruin my career." David looked at her, and for a moment there was something like pity in his eyes. "Your career? What about their futures? How many students have you discouraged? How many dreams have you killed with your realistic expectations?" She had no answer, but then something unexpected happened. A 5th student appeared in the doorway, a white girl with red hair and freckles, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Thompson? I'm Emma. I'm in Mrs. Anderson's class too." Everyone turned to her. "I just want to say, everything they're telling you is true. I've seen it, I've heard it, and I said nothing because—" She swallowed hard. "Because I was afraid she'd turn on me too, and because I benefited from it. She praises my work, encourages me, gives me opportunities. Not because I'm better than them, but because I'm white." Emma looked at Marcus, Jamal, Keisha, and Darnell. "I'm sorry. I should have said something before. I should have stood up for you." Marcus surprised everyone by walking over and hugging her. "You're saying something now." That matters. The emergency school board meeting that night was packed. Word had spread through the community like wildfire, social media posts, text chains, phone calls. Parents, students, teachers, community leaders filled every seat in the boardroom, with dozens more standing along the walls. David sat at the head of the table, his face grave. Beside him were the other board members, all looking varying degrees of shocked and uncomfortable as they reviewed the evidence presented during the closed executive session before the public meeting. Mrs. Anderson sat in the front row with her union representative, her earlier defiance replaced by resignation. David called the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to address serious allegations of discrimination at Lincoln High School. Before we hear public comment, I want to present the findings of our emergency investigation." He laid out everything: the recordings, the documented complaints, the pattern of bias spanning years. The room was silent except for occasional gasps and murmurs. Then came the testimonies. Marcus stood first, his voice steady as he described his experiences. Jamal, Keisha, and Darnell followed. Then Emma. Then others, students who'd been emboldened by their peers' courage to come forward with their own stories. A parent stood up, an older black woman with gray hair and steel in her spine. "My daughter graduated 3 years ago. Mrs. Anderson told her she wasn't college material. She's now in her 3rd year at Howard University, studying to be a doctor." Another parent. "My son was discouraged from taking AP classes. He took them anyway, at another school. Straight A's." The stories piled up, each one a testament to potential nearly crushed, dreams almost destroyed, futures threatened by one teacher's bias. But it wasn't just parents and students. Teachers began to speak too. A young white teacher stood. "I've tried to raise concerns about bias in our school before. I was told I was being too sensitive and needed to respect my senior colleagues." An older black teacher, tears in his eyes. "I've taught at Lincoln for 30 years. I've watched this happen over and over, to my students, to my own children. I stayed silent because I needed my job. I'm ashamed of that silence." When the public comment period ended, David stood. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier. What we've heard tonight is more than allegations against one teacher. It's a systemic failure, a failure of oversight, a failure of accountability, a failure to protect our most vulnerable students. He paused, looking directly at Principal Chen and the administrative staff sitting in the front row. "The board will be taking several immediate actions. First, Mrs. Anderson's employment is terminated, effective immediately." The union representative started to object, but David held up his hand. "Save it. This isn't negotiable. The evidence is overwhelming, and we have a legal and moral obligation to protect our students." He continued, his voice gaining strength. "Second, All students who received grades from Mrs. Anderson in the past 5 years will have their transcripts reviewed by an independent committee. Any grade that appears to be influenced by bias will be reassessed. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Third, mandatory bias training for all staff with regular follow-ups and assessments. No more one-day seminars. Real, substantive training. Fourth, the creation of a student advocacy board with real power to raise concerns and ensure they're addressed promptly. Students will no longer have to suffer in silence while we build cases. He looked at Principal Chen. And finally, a complete review of our administrative response protocols. The fact that complaints were documented for 2 years without action is unacceptable. Heads will roll, including mine if necessary, to ensure this never happens again. The room erupted in applause, but David wasn't finished. To the students who came forward today, Marcus, Jamal, Keisha, Darnell, Emma, and all the others, you showed more courage than many adults in this room. You stood up when it was hard. You spoke truth when it was risky. You are exactly the kind of leaders this community needs. He turned to Marcus, his eyes glistening. And to my son, who had to endure this while I sat on the very board responsible for preventing it, I'm sorry. I should have known. I should have seen. I failed you. Marcus shook his head, mouthing, "No, Dad." But David continued, his voice thick with emotion. No parent should watch their child be diminished. No child should have to prove their worth to someone who's already decided they have none. And no community should tolerate a system that allows this to happen. 3 months later, Lincoln High School looked different. Not physically, the same building, same lockers, same classrooms. But there was a shift in the atmosphere, a change in the culture. Marcus walked through the hallways with his head high. His new English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had not only accepted his Stanford application essay, she'd helped him strengthen it. She believed in his potential without qualification or surprise. Jamal was thriving in advanced physics. Keisha had received her acceptance letter from Stanford. Darnell was working on a new analysis of James Baldwin that his teacher was encouraging him to submit to literary journals. Emma had become one of the strongest advocates for equity in the school, using her privilege to amplify voices that had been silenced for too long. In David's office, he reviewed the quarterly report on the school's new initiatives. The Student Advocacy Board was meeting weekly. Bias incidents had dropped by 60%. Most importantly, students reported feeling heard, valued, respected. Marcus knocked on the door, poking his head in. "Dad? Got a minute?" David smiled, gesturing him in. "Always." Marcus sat down, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about what happened. With Mrs. Anderson." "Yeah. I'm glad she's gone. What she did was wrong. But I also feel, I don't know, sad for her?" David leaned back, studying his son. "Explain." "She wasted her whole career. 25 years she could have spent lifting students up, helping us succeed. Instead, she spent it tearing us down. That's a tragic waste. For her, but also for all the students she could have helped instead of hurt." David felt pride surge through him. This was what he'd hoped for, not just vindication or revenge, but understanding, growth, wisdom. "That's a mature perspective," he said. "More mature than mine, honestly." Marcus shrugged. "I learned from watching you. You didn't just want to punish her. You wanted to change the system, make it better for everyone who comes after us." "That's the goal," David agreed. "Though I'll admit, in the moment, I wanted to do more than just change systems." They both laughed, breaking the tension. "Dad," Marcus said after a moment, "thank you. For believing me, for fighting for me, for showing me what it looks like to stand up for what's right." David came around the desk and pulled his son into a hug. "You showed me first, Marcus. You and your friends. You refused to accept that this was just how things are. You demanded better. I was just following your lead." A year later, David stood on stage at Marcus's high school graduation. As board president, he gave the commencement address. "This graduating class is special," he told the crowd, "not just because of their academic achievements, though those are impressive, but because they taught the adults in this community a valuable lesson. Courage doesn't always come from experience or age. Sometimes it comes from young people who refuse to accept injustice as normal. He looked at Marcus, sitting with his classmates in cap and gown. Jamal, Keisha, Darnell, Emma, all there, all graduating with honors, all heading to top universities. These students could have stayed silent. They could have accepted the message that they weren't good enough, smart enough, capable enough. Instead, they stood up. They spoke out. They changed not just their own futures, but the futures of every student who will walk these halls after them. The audience applauded, but David held up his hand. We, the adults, the administrators, the board, the teachers, we owe them an apology. We should have created a system where they didn't need to be courageous, where their worth was never questioned, where their potential was always believed. He paused, his voice strengthening. But because they were courageous, because they spoke up, this school is better, this community is better, and hopefully the next generation of students won't have to fight the battles these young people fought. After the ceremony, David found Marcus surrounded by friends and family. His son was laughing, his face lit with joy and hope. "Stanford in the fall," Marcus said when he saw his father. "Can you believe it?" David smiled. "I always believed it, even when others didn't. Because you're my dad? Because I know who you are, what you're capable of, and because I watched you dismantle someone's prejudice with nothing but truth and courage." Marcus hugged him tight. We did it together, and they had. Father and son, student and parent, individual and community, all working together to ensure that dignity, respect, and opportunity weren't privileges based on skin color, but rights guaranteed to every student who walked through those school doors. Final message, call to action. The story of Marcus Thompson and Lincoln High School became a blueprint for districts across the country. Schools reached out to David and Marcus, asking how to implement similar reforms. Students shared their own experiences, inspired by Marcus's courage to speak their truth. Mrs. Anderson quietly left education. Reports suggested she was working in retail now. Some said she'd never really understood what she'd done wrong. Others claimed she'd had an awakening, that she was trying to make amends in small ways. But the real change wasn't about one teacher's redemption or punishment. It was about a system that finally listened to students who'd been talking all along. Because that's what systemic change looks like. It's not one conversation or one termination. It's building structures that protect the vulnerable. It's creating channels for voices to be heard. It's believing students when they tell you they're being harmed, instead of waiting 2 years to build a case. Most importantly, it's recognizing that bias doesn't just hurt the students who experience it directly. It hurts everyone. It robs communities of doctors who aren't encouraged to pursue STEM fields, of engineers who are told to be realistic, of leaders who are taught from a young age that their potential has limits based on their skin color. If this story resonated with you, it's because this happens every day in schools across the country. Students are discouraged, dismissed, and diminished by the very people who should be championing their success. But it doesn't have to be this way. Parents demand accountability. Students document everything and speak up. You have more power than you know. Teachers examine your biases and advocate for your students. Administrators listen when students tell you they're being hurt and act immediately instead of building cases. Share this story with educators, parents, and students who need to remember that change is possible when people refuse to accept discrimination as normal. Subscribe to Real Justice. Stories for more examples of courage defeating prejudice, of truth overcoming bias, of communities choosing justice over comfort. Because every student deserves teachers who believe in their potential. Every child deserves an education free from discrimination. And every community deserves schools where excellence isn't defined by skin color, but by opportunity fairly given and potential fully realized. Thank you for watching. Remember, the students are watching us. Make sure what they see is worth following. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who works in education. Subscribe for more stories that remind us why fighting for justice matters, because these aren't just stories about the past. They're blueprints for the future we're building together. See you in the next story.